few minutes.
Sorry.
You're fine, no problem. So, yeah, as Liz is saying, the session's recording this evening, so it'll be made available, and we'll also make available the slides as well. And I'll be attaching various different links to relevant sites and resources for you as well that you can have to review in your own time after the workshop is over. So I'm just going to share the screen with you here a second. Can you all see that okay? Okay, so just a quick background. I know most of you met me already in the last series. I think it's only me, Sean, and possibly Donald weren't on the previous one. So my name is Tom O'Leary from O'Leary and Associates Training and Consultancy based in County Kerry. And I've been, I suppose, working with the local development sector and the not-for-profit sector, as well as the SME sector for the last 20 years or so. Primarily working with groups around developing projects, feasibility analysis for projects, community planning, strategic and business planning, project planning, and then I work as a mentor and a trainer to various different groups and organisations, local development companies, public sector companies, local authorities as well. And a big part I do is looking at sourcing funds for community-based projects and not-for-profit projects. So a good bit of what work I do is work around project planning with groups that are applying for funds for specific projects, or who are looking at what are the issues in their locality or their locations that they need to address, and then working with them in terms of identifying what projects they can do and what projects they should be doing, and then helping them develop a project plan that will allow them to, I suppose, develop the project, but also look at when they're bringing that project for funding proposals, or they're bringing that project to other stakeholders, that they're very clearly defined project and very clearly defined project plan, an action plan with identified resources, budgets, and people to work on it. So a lot of what I do is around that. This is not like a project management course you're going to do in terms of a certification course or anything like that. I don't go into the whole academics and theory behind project planning. I look at it from a very practical point of view. But I find there's a lot of times when you do things like project management courses, it's very kind of academic. It's very focused on the kind of the process and all that involved, and people get kind of lost in it. I like to keep it very simple in terms of what's involved in actually in developing a project from the very initial initiation stage and come up with the ideas. When you decide not to progress with a project, when you decide, yeah, we are going to go ahead with it, and then how you manage that project over a course of a period of time. So what I'm going to be discussing over tonight's session and next two sessions is basically the steps that will be involved in any project. I'll take your lead on it this evening in terms of any specific things you want to look at, any type of projects you got in mind, any specific areas you want me to focus on. Rather than kind of going through things that are not really relevant to you, we look at what's relevant to yourselves and the work you're doing and the projects you are doing currently, or the projects you're hoping to get involved with. But a big part of what we're discussing as well is looking at, and we discussed this in the previous workshops on funding as well, is looking at when you look at developing projects and you're planning for projects, it's very important to look at the longer term impact of those projects. So it's just kind of we're having a brief discussion there before we come on in terms of funding. And long-term funding, and it's easy to get money for, not easy, it's easier to get money for projects and one-off things than long-term core funding to keep operations going, keep things operational. And we always try to get our groups we're working with to look at a project in terms of, if you develop this one-off project, it's more often not going to create a long-term legacy issue. So it's going to be something that's going to be in existence after the project is completed. So if it's an infrastructure project, for example, the plan is in terms of how do we get the infrastructure up and running. And then once it's up and running, that's that project completed in terms of getting it from idea to implementation to completion. But that now is in place, so it needs to be managed and maintained and sustained long term. So it's a big part of what we do is working with an early stage of a project plan, that we decide on, okay, if we develop this, is it sustainable afterwards? And if it's not, it's kind of knocked in the head pretty much at the very early stages of the project planning process. So it's something that we're trying to work more and more with groups on, is that the long-term impact of the projects they're developing. So that's a bit about me. So I suppose it's just really the kind of question I would have for yourselves. I'm just going to open up the screen a bit more so I can see everyone. I suppose key questions really is for yourselves before we continue on the program tonight and the next couple of weeks is in terms of, are you working any specific live projects at the moment that you're concentrating on or in the process of developing?
Yeah, in the middle of a couple, delivering on the final stages of a couple of projects at the moment.
Sure, the final stages, Alan, yeah?
Yeah, one we're basically ready to draw down on a river project at the moment.
Okay.
Leader, the usual stuff. They want to sign with this logo on it, and then they want a different logo.
Yeah.
The engineer's report, can you add this line in? And can you add this line in? And
okay.
More photographs, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Then we're doing another one with conifer removal up on a mountain and all kinds of problems. We have 3 stakeholders. We have MPWS, we have Culture, we have the funding body as well, and we're looking for AA screenings, all this kind of stuff, and the wording of the document is changing every day, and we have a deadline for the end of February. The board season comes in, so time's getting really pushed at the moment, and planning contractors wants to get out there. He says, if I don't get out there soon, we won't get the job done.
And in relation to those projects, Alan, you're working on, are you the primary person responsible for it, or have you a team of people that are working on that project?
We have a project team, and we sort of split up the projects depending. Really, it's where they are. We're cross border, so there's a lad takes the projects in the north, and I take the projects in the south. Mainly.
Okay. Very good. Okay, very good. Anyone else have any, and the rest of you got anything ongoing at the moment, or that's in the pipeline? Or are you coming out of the process like Alan at the final stages of any projects?
Well, we're in the middle of one, Tom.
Okay.
So it's an EIP. So yeah, I mean, we had a project plan at the start, but it's changing.
As they do.
So it's, I suppose, keeping on track of that, but also, because a lot of our projects involve a lot of community engagement as well as, agency engagement. The community engagement takes a long time, so that can stretch things out, and you're trying to get a project done on time, deliver it within the deadline, and sometimes it's a little bit beyond your control.
Okay.
So,
but that project, Trish, there is a deadline being set by the funders in relation to that has to be done by a certain time period.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Okay.
So,
okay. Anyone else in terms of any ongoing planned or just completed projects?
Well, we have a small one in the East Wicklow, the area that I'm involved in.
Yep.
Tom, it's cleaning up a little small river.
Okay.
We've had a few meetings with Quilcha. They were looking for insurance. I only got confirmation today that our insurance cover would probably cover us to do a so-called litter pick on the river.
Right.
We're not looking for any funding. It's just basically we need a few bodies, but we just have to get the all clear from Quilcha, and then we should be ready to go in the next few weeks if they give us the all clear.
Okay, very good. And anyone else?
We've 2 projects. Well, there's one on giant hogweed that we've done a survey on, and we've identified what needs to be done. But the implementing it now, it's a job that we did for the county council, but getting funding for the next stage of it is proving very problematic, and it's not there at the moment. And another project is we had a leader funding to do a feasibility study on a crayfish arc project. So that's just getting wound up at the moment. We're going through the reimbursement stage from leader, but the next stage would be how are we going to progress it? We have the feasibility study. So how do we progress it to the next point and getting all our ducks in a row?
Okay. And there's similar to Anna, you're working with a team there on developing that. So you're leading out on it. But have you a team working on that project with you?
What's your definition of a team?
Yeah. So it's not a
Yeah.
very big team, so I presume.
No.
You'd be at the bare 15, as I say.
Well, the crayfish one would be pretty small at the moment. That is
Yeah.
very much internal. But if there was, for the giant hogweed, yeah, you'd have a lot of stakeholder engagement. Like, I mean, the county council would have to be involved, and then the community engagement. We've done a lot of work on that, and we've got really good buy-in. So it just would be a shame to see it not move this year when all the community is engaged for helping making it happen. When I say like giving us access to the land, they are on board for that, but it's just the funding bit.
Okay, very good, very good. Okay, and anyone else looking at any specific projects?
Yeah, there's how are you? How are you? Kids in the background. Go.
That's no problem at all. Yeah. Mine could burst in any time. So okay.
So yeah, there's a fish barrier kind of program we're trying to set up in Wicklow. There's a barrier project developed there, or report in 2012. We're trying, the East Wicklow River Trust are trying to work with the council and fisheries and national parks to basically get a program together. We got funding for Ballinglen Bridge in South Wicklow on the Derry River, so the Derry water, and part of the vocal catchment. So that's it's a live project where Rivers have been contracted in to scope of work on an oversized bridge apron that's a cheapest barrier to fish migration.
Okay, very good. Okay, thanks, Tom. Okay, so I suppose the key thing really in terms of if you have some projects, ongoing projects there, like how big are they in terms of, say, financially? Like how big are these projects? Are they very large scale projects, or are they smaller? I know some of them might be smaller scale, but are you talking about like longer term projects that are going to require lots of funding, or are they mostly smaller scale projects that you're working on or have been working on?
Mine's medium scale, the 10s, 20, 30K projects. So.
Okay, so medium size, okay. And I say, yep.
Go ahead, Donald.
Me as well. Sorry, yeah. Mainly medium. Me, but I suppose that Ballinglen one might be close to 100,000. Okay.
Good. And Liz?
The giant hogweed project, we've costed it around 22 grand per year. The problem is the council often just give a year or maybe 3 years to deliver it, but it actually needs 5 years and possibly 7 years. But it's 22 grand each year at least. Maybe decreasing as we get the weed under control. But it's getting them to think long term.
So most of your projects, like say to date, like would be more kind of like say medium-sized projects rather than very large-scale projects.
A lot of our projects have been studies.
Yeah.
What's large scale, Tom? What do you class as large?
Yeah, I suppose like you were talking like your 100,000 plus type projects, that would be, just to be some fairly substantial funding involved in them and a lot of stakeholders involved and commitments involved. Without I would consider large. Obviously, you got larger than that as well, but in terms of I'd say small scale projects, like be kind of one-off smaller projects at a very localized level that can be kind of turned around pretty quickly, completed, done. And then you got your medium-sized ones, and then your larger, which would require a lot more. I suppose there'd be a lot more in terms of funding-wise, be more funds available, more to be creating more stakeholders involved, a lot more reporting, a lot more accountability as well. So just in terms of trying to get an idea in terms of the size of the projects and scale of the projects, because some projects will be managed by one person, they'll be developed by one person, initiated by one person, managed, evaluated, and signed off on by one person, and then the larger ones will have more and more input from different people, both within your organization and externally to your organization. So it's really kind of see where you're at in terms of the level of detail that you need to get involved with. The same thing that the question as well about the team in terms of a lot of the work you're probably doing is like literally down to yourselves if you're the main people involved in the organization. But I suppose from a project point of view, we would be kind of encouraging that you'd have a team involved. If there, and go back to your question, is in terms of how many people makes up a team. It all depends on the size of organization, but like we would try to bring in other people as well from external, other stakeholders get involved in the project also, So if you're looking at developing a project, like a one person that's developing it, they're kind of controlling the whole thing from start to finish. Like what we're talking about up tonight and over the next number of weeks is more around looking at how you're developing projects part from project team, how you can delegate tasks out to people. You know, you control, you can evaluate, you can monitor it, how you communicate within that team and to stakeholders as well. So some of the things I might be talking about might be relevant, directly relevant to what you're doing for smaller projects. They're more focused on kind of the medium to larger scale. If that's okay, but trying to make it as relevant as it possibly can for you. In your case, in terms of stakeholders, like who are your key? I know you mentioned there, Trish, in terms of the community is a big part of this, and that does take a lot of time. In terms of the other stakeholders that will be involved, who are the key people, let's say, in your projects to date that would be included? Obviously, you got your local authorities, you got your various different agencies, but like typically, how many groups or stakeholders will be involved in your projects?
Well, I mean, common for all of us here tonight would be the agencies like LAWPRO, the IFI, the national parks, the EPA, the local authority. Depending on what you're doing, Quailcha, there might be, Bordy Scavara, or, there could be a couple of coastal ones involved as well. So there could be anything up to as many as like 12 or something of the agency stakeholders involved. Depending on the project. And then from a community perspective, like you could be, like we are finishing up on a project where we had engaged with 200 people in the community. So, that's directly talking to them, not through a public consultation or a community meeting. That's actually directly talking face to face to 200 people. So there's quite a lot of people involved in some of them.
Okay. Again, I suppose the question there is in terms of their involvement. At what stage are they typically involved from the very beginning? Like your agencies, your community, like from the very outset, and are they brought along the entire process then with you, or are they just kind of consulted with as needs be throughout the process?
I suppose we would always put the community first and foremost. So we would normally talk to them first, find out what they want and what their feedback is on the projects. And then you're going off talking to the agency. So you're going back and forth to community a lot. And if you're dealing with people's land, then you're in and out, chatting to them, on a pretty regular basis. So it would be fairly consistent communication with the community. Stakeholders might be on and off then.
Okay. So. And are you, and this is like for everyone, are you finding that your project, the kind of planning process that you're following is being kind of dictated by the stakeholders' involvement in terms of trying to meet their various different criteria and to follow their guidelines and to kind of follow the process they want you to follow? So like Anna mentioned about leader, you're very much kind of like your project plan is kind of very much kind of dictated really by what you can and what you can't do based on your funding and based on what the criteria is for funding. But do you find that they're kind of dictating the planning process, or they just basically kind of on the outside where they're consulted with, they're communicated with, but they're not really directing the entire thing? They have an involvement, but they're not overly in control of it.
Well, I mean, there's the reporting, which needs, you have to, come in with that all the time. But also I find that because you're reporting on a kind of a fairly frequent basis, it does sort of dictate the project to a certain extent, because you have to keep within certain guidelines, and I have to get this done because that's needed for the funders. So it does kind of dictate you to a certain extent, which isn't ideal, I would say, because sometimes if a project goes off on a little bit, on a bit of a meander, let's say, in a direction, that's a good meander for the project, but that's outside of the remit what the funders were looking for. You could come up with a problem there and have to go back to the funders and that kind of thing. So there needs to be more flexibility, I would think. Like some of the funders are great and they have that flexibility, and then others are a bit more rigid about it. Like leaders, very rigid. But yeah, and like that takes time. That takes up your time. And
yeah, I think it's the key thing. This and it's the difference between, say, the public sector or community projects and, say, private projects. So if you go to, say, a private company developing a project in house, let's say developing a software platform or developing a website or developing a new product or new markets, whatever, they kind of control the entire process themselves in house because they're in control of every element of it. Okay, there is input from their customers and suppliers, et cetera, et cetera. But when it comes to a community project where you might have multiple funders in some cases or multiple stakeholders involved, and the community, it can be very difficult to manage all the moving parts of that because you've got different agendas, you've got different perceptions of what things are, you've got different definitions. So what we kind of encourage groups we work with is that from the very, very outset, they define really very clearly for everyone what the project is going to be. And that definition might be dictated by the project you're going for, the funding you're going for, and has to fit certain criteria. But that they work kind of in parallel with the stakeholders and the community kind of side by side and can constantly be in contact with them there. We've seen a good few projects now over the last while, in especially projects that are the local authority are involved in, that it goes along nice and smoothly for a while, and then they just hit a barrier because there was that level of consultation wasn't there with the community, or there's been an issue has been raised in terms of maybe a planning issue or an environmental issue or an objection or something like that, and the whole thing just comes to a standstill, and there's then mediation involved. Okay, and when you go back and you ask them where did it all go wrong or why did it go wrong, it's really that everyone wasn't brought together at the same pace at the same time and moved along. So someone was left out of the discussion, and it creates problems online. So what we try to do is we try to get groups to kind of sit down in terms of, okay, who are the key people involved here? Who needs to be involved? Who needs to be involved on a lesser scale? But the key thing is that everyone's clear on the definition of the project. So when we're dealing with, say, the larger scale projects, the large infrastructural projects, we normally would recommend that they form a project management team that is represented by all the various stakeholders. So there's stakeholders represented around the table, so that they then bring back the information to their. So, for example, if the county council are involved in it, there's a rep from the county council on the project management team. If Leader are involved in it because they're funding it, there's a rep from Leader involved in the project management team. The community rep, if there's community involvement, they're involved, and the organisation obviously involved as well. They might assign someone within the organisation to manage the project, or if it's a large-scale capital project, they might actually hire in or contract in a project manager to manage the entire thing, depending on how big the project is. But the key thing is that all the people that have an input and have a say and have an influence on the project are around the table. So there's no kind of surprises anywhere along the line that someone's not aware of this happening or that happening, and it comes to a standstill. So we'll be talking about in the later workshops, we're talking about risk management and assigning, identifying potential risks to the project from start to finish. And sometimes that risk is just the level of communication and the level of involvement of the various different stakeholders. Typically, it happens with local authorities where you've got communities that are driving a project, but they're not informing or engaging with the council at early enough stage. And then when you go to them with the ideas and to run a developer looking for funding, it just says, like, if you came to us at the beginning, this would be an awful lot easier. We're doing funding applications at the moment for a community services fund. And in the question, one of the criteria is that they have to have engaged with the council before they've applied for the funding. And people are kind of saying, why is that? And it makes perfect sense because they've now engaged. If they've engaged with the council prior to actually going ahead with a funding application, they'll be made aware of the issues the council would have with the project, and they would have kind of ironed out those difficulties and issues before they actually go ahead with the project itself, which kind of makes sense. So if the local area engineer needs to be involved, that they're consulted with, not when it comes to the point where they've got the project kind of pretty much done and written down on paper and they're trying to implement it, it's kind of too late at that stage. So by setting up a very, very, a good project management team, and that project management team doesn't have to meet regularly just to stay really, but they're communicated with and they're involved throughout the whole process. That can save a lot of time and effort and energy and problems down the line. But you made a point there, Trish, that it has to be, and this is the problem with a lot of project management, is that it's so rigid in terms of we have a project plan, we have to stick with it, and there's very little flexibility there. It has, just by the nature of the work you're doing, has to be flexible. because deadlines will be missed. There'll be things happening. There'll be spanners thrown into the works. There'll be issues coming up constantly that you have to be able to adjust and be flexible with it. If you can try to identify those as early as possible in the process, it does save you time. And that's why we recommend a lot of groups that they talk to other communities, what they've done, similar projects, and ask them where were the problems, where were the issues, so they can build those into their project plan. This could come up as a problem. How do we deal when it comes up? How do we prevent it from happening? Okay, so a lot of this kind of like is really pre-planning work when you're looking at your projects. And as then for the smaller scale one, doesn't really matter that much. It's in a lot of cases they're very small, but from the medium and larger ones, absolutely, it's really how we get the stakeholders involved. So it's kind of the point here in terms of how you get them involved in like your team. Get them around the table. Now, some people don't like that because they don't want the agencies to be sitting around the table, but it does save a lot of problems and issues down the line. And in some cases, the agencies won't get involved. They don't want to get involved in that level. So I think I look at how else we communicate with them back and forth and how we get them involved in some other level. They might just want kind of ongoing reports. But I rather that they're part of the process on an ongoing basis, because it does stop those issues from arising later on. So the reporting structure, so the chain of command, and this is what I mean by chain of command, is really in terms of who ultimately gives, in terms of your positions within your organization, who ultimately makes a decision in terms of, yes, we're going to have this project, we give it our blessing, and yes, we'll drive on with it, and who ultimately then signs off on it and kind of, is ultimately responsible for it. So is that GE, or is there if you come up with an idea or you see there's an opportunity out there, how do you progress it? Or have you got the power yourselves to, with your own roles, to actually say, okay, we found something here, we found the funding, we've identified an opportunity here, we just go with it? Is there a chain of command there you got to follow? Does that make sense?
Yeah, we'd bring it to the board and just run it by the board, make sure they're good with it and feel happy with it. Make sure the treasurer says, the flow of money's okay there, everything's in place. I think the biggest risk, maybe too many projects that you mentioned before coming in at the same time or overlapping, that we sort of, sometimes you have to hit the brakes or clutch a little bit, and slow down in some cases. So, but yeah, we generally get consensus between everybody, and we mightn't wait for an official meeting. We might do it in WhatsApp or something like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. No, there's a group we work with here. I do a lot of work with in Tralee, a disability organisation, and they have a very good process of doing this. At every board meeting, or if there's something comes up between board meetings, they put into their agenda like a 10-minute kind of like new opportunities on the agenda. That might be funding opportunity, or might be an opportunity to engage with another agency, or might be an opportunity for promotion, or whatever it might be. But they'll have a 10-minute slot in the agenda for that. And they agree that, as you said there, Alan, the board will say to the coordinator, look, you've got too much on at the moment. We're just basically swamping enough of projects. Let this one go for the time being. But then discuss it and see, well, what's the value to the project? What's the long-term impacts of it? Is it worth it? And they kind of discuss it for a while. And as you say, they do something similar if they have an executive then as well. So if there's something they need to make a decision on before a board meeting, or kind of a faster turnaround time, they'll call an executive Zoom call or whatever, and they just basically make that decision there. But it just stops that, you're in the middle of maybe one or two projects and you throw another project into the mix. That's just is not good, So again, that's what I'm saying about chain of command, is that you have a lot of organizations there that will just drive and just keep going after everything, and that creates massive problems. Because going back to the point we mentioned at the very beginning, how do you sustain these projects afterwards, after they're started? How do you keep them going, and what's involved after we kick this thing off? So we kind of call it like the kind of the initial stage of the process. Many projects get just basically shut down before we even get to the starting point, because it's decided that it might be okay, but just the negatives here outweigh the positives with this project. We might regret it afterwards, but we made a decision to shut it down, and that's a good thing, rather than going the whole process and then realizing that this is going to be an absolute mess. And that's why it's so important to look at the kind of the longer term impacts as well. Okay, so I suppose the question then in terms of what is, like, in your opinion, what is a project? What do you define as a project?
Well, we have our strategic plan, and in terms of like when we have areas that we want to work on, and then if a project can help deliver an objective, like when we have our core our core aims and objectives as an organization, and said, okay, if we're picking a project or seeing an opportunity that comes in, does that fit into our objectives? And then I suppose a project would be trying to, if there's money to do it, when we do a funding application. And this is our problem, is that we jump on too many opportunities, or people say, oh, we should go for that. And you're going, okay, can we do it? It goes back to your last point, but what we pick as projects are often defined by what our objectives are. Even if there's around 7 core objectives, and is there an opportunity that comes up that we can deal with, or is there a demand from a community group within our catchment that is looking for help on something? That would define a project as well.
Okay, so that's it's a good point this year, and this again goes back to the very things we talked about at the very beginning in terms of core funding. And the reason why a lot of organizations struggle with the whole concept of how do we sustain our operations in terms of what we're doing on an ongoing basis, is because they do exactly what you're talking about there. They develop a strategic plan, and the strategic plan is implemented through a series of projects that kind of lead to the ultimate achievement of the various different goals and objectives or whatever it might be. So when we work with any organization, that's exactly what happens. They say, okay, well, we need to provide a service within our community, we need to provide facilities within our community, we provide whatever it might be we're doing. And because it's kind of done through a kind of a mixed match of funds, they look at it from the point of view, it's all done kind of a bit by bit and project by project by project by project, just get to the end point. And that's the issue, and that's where majority of not-for-profit organizations struggle, is because they're constantly looking for that source of money, that pot of money that's going to actually help them get to the next level and the next level and the next level. Whereas you take that, compare that to, say, a company that's got a regular income coming in, like a private company or a social enterprise or whatever. Projects are just additional stuff they add on to the overall organization. They're one-off things they do that add to the overall organization, or they support it, but they're not seen as the vehicle to keep the organization going. Does that make sense? So, and that's what happens. It's exactly what happens with groups that are constantly looking for funding to keep the show on the road, whereas projects are one-off that should be just adding to that and adding value to the organization, not keeping it going as such. So what we define, I suppose, what the rest of you, what do you define as a project? How would you define a project?
I suppose, Tom, it's something like you want to achieve. Say, just take the little project that we're working on. So there's a stretch of river, probably about a kilometre and a half, that we just want to clean up. And just listen to what you're saying. We don't need funding for this one. We just need bodies. And it's over a 2 or 3 year period is what we're reckoning for that project. So there are other projects going on in East Wicklow as well, as Donald had said. But the one that I'm concentrating on is just that one project, even though I'd help out on the other ones if required. Do you understand me? So that's the way I look at a project. You just
exactly. So
one.
Yeah. So in like your case, because there's no funding really needed or required for it, you're looking in terms of how do we develop this, in terms of how do we actually get the bodies around to do it. So it's more like in terms of how do we allocate tasks and delegate tasks to people, and when they're going to do it and how they're going to do it, and how that task needs to be organized as well and managed. More so that's a very good example, because that can be sustained, because it's basically, well, it can be sustained if there's volunteers to do it. It can be sustained, and if the volunteers start disappearing, then there's an issue with that. But yeah, that's a good example of it, where you're actually managing the tasks. Really, you're not really worried about funding sources and all that kind of stuff. And if the work is done and there's an impact in terms of the actual impact of the river being cleaned up, there's an obvious impact there. You can evaluate the work you're doing, on an ongoing basis. But for the rest of you, do you see the organizations you're working for as projects?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the issue. That's like, it's there's two words that create problems in my head for the sector across the board. One is the word project, right? And the second is program. Okay, because they see the organization as being either a project or a program, and that's the worry, because a project has an end date. It's completed, but you want to be there long term. You want to be looking at the long term vision of where you're going to, how you keep that going long term. If you're looking at an organization from a project or programming perspective, there's always going to be a finish date. You always going to have to start all over again to get to next level, and that's not sustainable long term. And that's the issue that we're bringing to the table on a lot of different levels for a lot of the projects we're working on with public sector and with everything else. That they're fantastic ideas, and they do an awful good things, but they're not sustainable, and very, very few of them are sustainable. And that's the issue, and that needs to be addressed, I think, across the board. Now, that's not for us to solve tonight or the next 3 nights, but it's something just be wary of. Try to get out of the mindset that we're focusing on projects only to keep the show on the road here, because if you do, you're always going to end up finishing one, moving on to the next, moving on to the next, moving on to the next, and that leads to serious burnout, you know. And look, it's going to be the way until we find some way of bringing in sustainable funding into it, but just be careful with that. So the project is basically a unique thing. So it's either a product or service or something you're providing that's unique, sometimes one-off, or might be part of a wider thing. It's time limited, and this is the issue with it. The project is supposed to have a start date and a finish date. You know, it's supposed to complete it. Those time limits can be set by your funders. In a lot of cases, it will be that the project has to be completed by a certain date. That creates its own pressures. It can be a good thing too, because it does force people into that time frame. But it is time limited, and that is the issue with it. Basically, the project should end when all the objectives of that project are achieved or abandoned. So, in your case, Sean, the project would end if there was ever, got to a point where there was never any more litter or anything within the river, which never, will never happen. There's always going to be need for it. But the project you might split this into, like, this is our project, is going to start and finish for this time period for this year, and the next year kicks off again, and the following year kicks off again. Okay, but it's completed when the objectives are achieved. Okay, so you'll find for the Tidy Towns group, for example, they'll have an annual plan, and they'll have, they want to achieve certain things, and they'll have done. But they might kickstart it again the following year. Okay, but it's very much done within a certain time frame. And that's another issue then as well, that people are just completely unrealistic about what they're trying to achieve, and they set way too kind of, their objectives are not achievable at all. And that creates problems too. So again, when we're looking at projects with our groups, we say, okay, well, what's manageable? What can you do? What is possible? And what can you achieve? And anything that they feel they can't do, you just take off the agenda, you take it away, because it doesn't happen then. And I suppose that's the key difference between, say, your project and your operational. So your operational are ongoing. So they're your everyday work you do as an organization. So if you take, say, my company as an example, we've core standard stuff we do constantly every single year, your training, your mentoring, et cetera. And then we take on projects then throughout the year. But they have a start date in terms of your contract to do a piece of work. We have a finish date, we get it completed, it's done. Okay, so, but that doesn't keep my business afloat, because otherwise you're constantly chasing new projects the whole time and fighting and selling and going out there. So we have, regular work that we come in that keeps the operations going. So the operations side of the business and the project side of the business. That's why I would structure my own company. For a not-for-profit organization, it's the same. You're trying to say, okay, well, what's the operational side of this organization? How do we keep salaries paid? How do we keep rent paid? How do we keep insurance paid? What can we do to keep bringing money in? And then projects will add to that. They'll bring in additional revenue, but they're to add to the wider overall aim of what you're trying to do. Okay, but if you're completely reliant on bringing in project money to keep the operational side of it going, that's where the sustainability finishes. Because it's not. Because if funding isn't there for projects, if there's no projects, if there's nothing out there, if you find that we've done everything we possibly can do, we're trying to struggle to come up with something innovative now, to come up with something new, to bring in additional money in, that creates a problem as well. So, and this is the key thing, the key part, and this going back to what I said earlier, is that you need to look at the longer term commitments that the project is going to have. So the impact of this project, what's the longer term implication there? So even take, Sean, your project there you have in Wicklow, and back to, like, say, you're relying on volunteers.
Yeah.
So if we start this now, we'll have fierce enthusiasm, hopefully, at the start. but this will be required to be done every year. You know, how do we sustain that? How do we keep the volunteers engaged? How do we keep them motivated? How do we keep them coming back? How do we keep this thing going? So in 5 years' time, how do we manage this? How do we see it happening? Because once you start it, you need to continue it. Okay, because there's been impact there, and people see the impact of it, and that's the key thing. So a big part of what we do is looking at the longer term side of it in terms of, right, we can start this year. We know we can. We have the money in place to do it, or the people in place to do it. But in 3 to 5 years' time, when it's still needed, how do we start building in things now to sustain it? You know, so like the initial project funding or support is like, you know, the old-fashioned engines in the car, kind of you wind it up and it gets started, but you need to have something to keep the engine going after that, you know, and that's the key thing. So looking in terms of, like, you know, what is the operational cost afterwards, or the support we need after this project is started on a longer term basis. And again, that's why you don't like pilot projects or pilot funds, because that's all they are. But you created an impact, you created an expectation in your community, and now you don't have any funding or support to keep it going, and that's a problem. And you feel you have to keep it going. So it's just be careful with that you do build that into the initial stages when you're defining your project and deciding what you want to do. Does that make sense in terms of what I mean by the difference between your operational and your project work?
Yeah.
You know, projects should just only be adding value to what you're currently doing. You know, not being like the band-aids to stop the hemorrhage of cash out of the organization, because that's not sustainable. Okay. So the process then, and again, I like to keep this as kind of simple as possible in terms of the process and what's involved. So what I'm going to do tonight is give you an overview in terms of the process from start to finish, and then over the next 2 nights we'll go into more specifically in terms of the different elements of that, and we'll also look in terms of key things that you want me to focus on over the next 2 workshops, if that would be in terms of, you know, the budgeting side of the project, the management side of it, the evaluation side, the communication side of it, or using things like project management tools, and a kind of more practical approach to this. We can do that also. So I'll take your lead on that towards the end of the workshop this evening. But tonight really is about looking at the overview of the process itself, and to see what are the steps that we would follow in the projects we work on or work with our groups on. So basically, there's 4 main steps in the project management process. The first is the initiation stage, where you're coming up with the idea for a project. That might be coming from yourselves, or that might be coming from an opportunity, again, in relation to funding, or might be something that is just has to be completed because an issue has come up and a problem is being identified that needs to be solved, and something needs to be done about that problem. The second phase is the planning phase. And that's those first 2 is kind of where we work with groups on mostly, is on the initial stages and the planning stage. So planning stage is where you're literally writing down how you're going to do this and what's involved in it. The execution stage or implementation stage is where you're actually doing the work. So you're actually out there doing the tasks, and you're doing the work that needs to be done to achieve the objectives, and you're managing that process as you go along. And then finally, you complete the process. So you complete the project. You finish the project, you close the project, and that point then is in terms of, right, how do we close off this project? If it's a funding project like Leader project, that includes all the reporting, all the sign-offs, all the drawdowns, all everything else to shut the project down. But that's where a lot of organizations kind of have a problem, because they feel, well, we need to continue the work we're doing here. You know, it was a one-off, but we need to continue it. And that's the issue. So is it really a project that you're actually developing, or is because it's not, it's done, it's completed, but it needs to be kept ongoing? So you take in from the point of view, let's say, of Sean's project or any of your projects where you might be doing a feasibility study, which is a one-off. So it's a study that's got a start date and finish date, and you got a report and recommendations, all of it, that are implemented or not implemented. It's done, it's dusted, it's finished. But you have then projects like, the work you're doing in terms of the environmental work you're doing, or the sustainability work you're doing, or the prevention works, whatever it might be. They don't stop at the end date. They might stop from the point of view of funding, because the funding is now finished and we've completed what we said we do, but the work is always going to be required. It's not going to be an issue that's going to be resolved and that's it. We're not going to wake up some morning and that's it. There's no more problems with rivers, no more problem with pollution, no more problems with anything, or management of whatever. There's nothing, it's always going to be there, it's like we work with organizations that are working with, various cancer organizations, disability organizations. There'll always be a requirement for them to be in existence. Okay, so even though they have a project, the project is finished, but that work has to continue on, and that's really important thing. So when we look at most project management workshops and courses involved around, the completion date of a project and what that involves and how you evaluate, how you report, we also look at, right, what are the next steps here now that we've done this, what do we do now, and that's where I focus on, because that's where I think the real value of these things are. So it's really about, at this point, we look at what happens down here. Okay, so we built the kind of the end date into, let's look at this idea, but if we start this thing, can we keep it going? What difference it's going to make? And it's something we need to look at longer term. So if you take, say, even like, say, there's been a lot of work across the country and work being continued on developing the greenways that are fantastic, and were very detailed projects that require a lot of analysis and a lot of planning and a lot of discussion and negotiation with landowners, etc. And a lot of them have gone over to the point where now everything's in place and the infrastructure has been put in place. But I'm always asking the question, what happens at the end of it? When you put down this greenway, then what happens? Who's responsible for maintaining it? We're involved in one in Kerry here. It's happening. It's going to be launched. It's going to be open probably by the start of summer. But the destination point of the greenway, there's nothing there. There's nothing for the person who gets to the end to do. There's no car park. There's no facilities. There's no hospitality. There's nothing there. And I can talk about, should you have that in place first before you put on the actual road to get there? And it was like, no, because we're concentrating on this part only. So it's all focused on the actual doing the project, but no one's thinking about the long-term implications of doing that. So again, it's something we always build into the capital projects, because again, it might be a building project, which is very clearly, start date, finish date, the building's open, the ribbon's cut, it's launched, and then everyone forgets about it and walks away, job done. But no one thinks about, how do we pay for the rent, how do we pay for the lights, how do we pay for the insurance afterwards, how do we get people in here? And that's the other problem. So we always look at it from the point of view, from a not-for-profit project, what do we look at, what's going to look like when it's completed, and how do we keep the work we've done, keep it going. So they're your four main steps that we would focus on, and everyone would focus on when developing a project. I take a bit different angle on it, at different points, purely from a not-for-profit project, because it's different than your typical, say, commercial project. So the initiation stage, really, and this is where I suppose where the ideas come from for projects. And when we're working with groups, I suppose there's three ways that they identify a need for something to be done, or a project to be done in the first place. First of all, they've, as Liz said there, you put together a strategic plan, and you look at your overall strategy and say, okay, what do we need to do to achieve our aims here? And that might be, we need to do a number of different projects or different things to do it. So it comes from a strategic review, an analysis of where we are at, and all of that then comes, identify projects we can develop. It might come from an opportunity that's been identified, and again, that normally is then linked to funding. So funding stream has been announced, and you're thinking, okay, we can avail of that funding. How do we do it? It's for a project. It's not for existing work we do. It's not the extension of existing work. It's for a new project, a new initiative. So you sit down and say, can we come up with a project that matches this funding? Again, I don't like that, because you're not trying to create a project just to draw down a grant. It mightn't actually be relevant to your overall strategic aims, or might be slightly, or might just kind of hamper other projects you're involved with, or deflect funding or resources away from your core responsibilities. So I'd always question why you create something just to draw down a grant, or just to identify funds. Typically, sometimes there's going to be problems can be identified. So if you look at, say, COVID over the last 2 years, created numerous problems within across every sector, and it forced people to look at, we need to do something here, because we've got a situation where we can't do what we normally did. We have to do it a different way, and that forced people to sit down and come up with ideas in terms of how they were going to do what they're supposed to do now with a COVID situation. So if you take in, for example, some of the projects we worked at, that we're providing service for people on the ground. People come in getting meals in a daycare, for example, that stopped. People come in to do courses in a disability organization or do training, that stopped. People going out doing work experience stopped. People working in the community, all that stopped. But the need was still there, so they had to sit down and identify, how do we provide a service in a different way, going online, doing it hybrid or whatever it might be. So they sat down and said, okay, we need to develop a project here. We need to look at how we do this. What we need in terms of equipment, resources, staffing, funding, how do we do it, how are we actually going to get this thing off the ground. And it created people to be very, very innovative, and people being very creative in a very, very short period of time, because the problem came up that had to be solved. Okay, so there's 3 reasons. 1, it comes out of a review process. 2, it comes out of an opportunity that this has come up for you, and that's coming from an external source, or it's a problem that you've identified that needs to be addressed, and you need to look at ways of doing that. So typically, it's really from the opportunity and review, but you will come up with a situation where you're trying to react to issues, and you're developing projects or something to get over that. So you've got project ideas. So what we normally would do then is look at the review process and sit with a group and say, okay, let's come up with ideas and do some brainstorming. What can we do? What are the options here for us? We sit down with a committee, we sit down with stakeholders, sit down with the community and ask them what they want, what are their ideas, what's their input into it. And we come up with different ways of doing different things. So, what are our options here? And then all that, backwards and forwards, we look at what's possible, what's not possible. And then we kind of, then we start defining what the project is going to be. So if it's a project where, again, we're looking at a project currently where they're looking at a building, looking at biodiversity projects, sensory gardens, playgrounds, work within the local village. There are all these ideas, and we're now deciding, okay, what ones we're going to focus on first, second, and third, and let's start defining that project. What's going to look like? What's that project going to be about? What's going to be involved in the project? Let's put some sort of shape on it. Okay, so the project is defined. Clearly what it's going to be, what it looks like. The team is decided upon, okay, who's best positioned to develop this and roll out with it. If there's a team there. If there's not a team there, then if it's a one-person idea coming from one person, being driven by one person, that to me is a kind of a non-runner from the start. There might be one person driving it, but if one person is there from the start to the finish, that's not going to really work. So who's the project team? Who do we need to bring on board? Is there any specific skills we need to bring on board in this? Is there any key stakeholders we need to have involved around the table on this? And what's that project team look like? So we would work a lot with groups on that in terms of identifying who the project team is going to be. Okay, now this is not purely talking about not-for-profit organizations. It's different with companies because of the staff and things like that. But with a project team, we look at who are the key people, and they don't necessarily have to be part of the organization that you're working with. Very often, not they're people brought in with externally that have experience or expertise that can add to the project. And then you decide, I suppose, part of the goals. What's the overall aim of the project? What are you trying to achieve here? And this is the key thing. And again, when a lot of groups are looking at funding opportunities and they're developing projects for the fund, so they're trying to match the project with a fund, very often they don't really have very clear aims in terms of what they're trying to achieve, what they're trying to do, or the aims are just kind of completely different than what they're supposed to be doing. At that point, we normally would, if we're involved, we're asking our opinion on it, we normally would shut it down at that point. Okay. If someone can't tell me, or if a group or an organization can't tell me, what's the impact this project is going to be? What does good look like at the end of this project? What are we trying to achieve here? And they're not very clear on that, then I'm just thinking, okay, they're just basically creating something just to create a vehicle to draw on money. That's not a good idea at all. So be very clear in terms of what the aims are and the objectives and what you're trying to do. And then I suppose finally looking at what resources you require. So like Sean's project, funding isn't the issue. It's about human resources. How do we resource this with people? Do we have enough people to get involved? If it's funding, where is the funding going to come from? Is there sufficient funding available through the source we've identified? Is there matching funds required? What's the long-term financial position of this when we complete it? If at this point you can't identify the resources to complete the project, or even to begin the project, then it's basically stopped. So what this stage basically is where you're looking at the idea. So it's a bit like, again, if you're developing a product, you're looking at the product idea, does it work? You're researching it, you're testing it, you're evaluating it, you're doing everything you possibly can before you go to the next stage where you're actually spending time and money to actually developing it. And at this point, at this phase, you decide whether we go forward or not with the project. Okay. So what would happen this situation, if you take, say, a funding situation, like say with Leader, this might be kind of your expression of interest kind of stage where you're bringing an idea to them. You've well thought out, you kind of know what you're about, you know what you're going to do. You've got the project very, very clearly defined and the aims, and you've a pretty good idea of the resources required, and you're presenting that proposal to them. But before that, you're presenting the proposal to your board or to your stakeholders and saying, look, is this something that we should be driving ahead with? Is it something that meets our agenda, meets our aims? Is something that we feel we should be doing as an organization? Is there another organization better positioned to us to do it? Are we duplicating here somewhere? Are we going to cause displacement here somewhere? And if it's agreed, then we go to the next level. Then you bring it to your potential funders or your other stakeholders. If it's a case where you're going to your community with a project, and again, a lot of groups I work with do, they'll bring the ideas to the community and they'll ask the community to kind of give their blessing on the project. Is this something we should be progressing with as a community? We had a meeting this morning with Kerry County Council for the project. We presented a proposal to them and they shut it down. They said, yeah, you can go forward if you want. You can apply for funding for it, but the chance of getting funded would be very, very slim. We would recommend you not go ahead with it in its current format. So now we're back to the drawing board again. We're back to this stage up here where we're redefining the project. Right, we're not going to scrap the idea. The idea is still there. We just need to figure out how we're going to do it on a different level. Okay. So what we could have done is gone straight from this part, forget about this last point, and gone straight into actually developing the project and the action plan and spending time and effort and money on it, and then be shut down at the very end. But no, we know that in its current format, it's not going to get, to level 2. So we got to go back and we got to look at defining the project. The project team won't change. The overall aim of what we're trying to do won't change. What will change is the definition of the project, because we're now scaling it back. Okay, and that's important, and it kind of goes back to the point you made, Trish, there earlier, where your projects need to be flexible. You've got a situation where if we get stopped going this road, we need to find another road to go down because we still need to do the work. We just need to figure out our way of doing it. Okay, and that's where there's be flexibility, built into it, because the council in this situation, in the terms of today's project this morning, they're a stakeholder in this, because they actually own the site the property's on. They're involved. So we got them involved earlier. So they've put a stop to this in its current format, but it's not going to stop. We're just going to redefine it. And that's really important, that you can go back and review the project and look at it again, rather than scrapping from saying it's not going to work. We just do it a different way if we can do it a different way. Okay. So this is kind of a very important stage in the whole process, because it will stop you from going forward. In some cases, something that's not going to work or not be sustainable, but it does force you to relook at how you're doing things and how you're going to get around it. Okay, so if it's a resources issue, how do we address that? They're the key things. Can we do it? Is there resources out there? If there's not, can we do it? And if there's not, we might be able to do it. Might scrap it. So we just can't do it. Okay, so that's an initiation stage where you come up with the ideas. Typically on the analysis point, again, I would question if organizations don't have some sort of plan or business plan or strategic plan, where the project's coming from, what are they based on, what are they linked back to. Okay, and it's something I discussed on the workshop on the grant switching as well. How does this project that you're looking at, how does it fit in with national and local policy as well? How does it fit in with their priorities? Okay, so they're kind of questions you would ask at this point, when you're sitting down looking at the overall project before you move to the next level. Okay, because again, at this point as well, this part here will be the basis of your funding proposals down the line. Okay, so this early stage, so getting this right at the beginning is going to be kind of really your starting point for everything. Just kind of saying, look, we'll go ahead and drive on with it, and not think and ask yourself these questions. Normally, we'll end up in the project not happening, or worse, the project happening but not being completed on time or within budget, because again, it was rushed into it. Again, for smaller projects, very small projects, you won't have to go into this level of detail, obviously, but for the medium-sized, large-scale projects where there's a bit of commitment involved, it's worth sitting down and identifying where you need to go with these things. The plan then. So, and this goes back to, again, the point where it doesn't necessarily have to be all about money. Sometimes it's down to, in terms of how do we actually get this thing done. And the money might be there, like, there might be no issue with money, but the project might just fall apart because it's not being planned and implemented properly. So when we look at the project action plan, and again, if we're writing a strategic plan for a group or a business plan for an organization, we'll always include an action plan, because the action plan is really the most important part of it. Otherwise, this won't happen. Where you've got, policies and aims and objectives, but you don't have any action plan in terms of how they're going to be implemented with very key detail on it, normally they don't happen. Like an awful lot of projects that are put forward by government departments or by local authorities, they don't progress at all, because you ask, where's your action plan? There's none. You have to see action plans where there's tasks identified. There's no one assigned to those tasks. There's no budget assigned to those tasks, no timeline assigned to those tasks. They're just words on paper at that stage. So when we're putting an action plan together, you're looking at the tasks that are involved. So what do we need to do to get this project over the line? What are the key things that need to be done? Do we have anyone to delegate to? And this goes back to the point we made this earlier on. If it's a one-person kind of show, or everything's down to one person to do everything, and there's no way to delegate because there's no people to delegate to, that's just not sustainable either. For two reasons: one, because one person can't do everything, and two, if that person can do everything but they decide to leave, then you got a major problem on your hands. Then the whole thing falls apart. So look at the tasks that are involved, who we can delegate those tasks to. And that could be people outside the organization. It doesn't have to be necessarily people within the organization. It could be obviously volunteers, it could be stakeholders, anyone. The budget. At this stage, the budget, you might have a clear, you might have an estimate of a budget. You might have a clear budget agreed on or identified. So you might put in like indicative costs at this stage, or indicative budget at this stage, the planning stage. That could come later on as you do further and further work into it. Timelines. With every project, as you just said earlier on, a project has a start date and finish date. Okay, that's what makes it a project. If there's no finish date on it, it's not a project. It's just something that will never get completed. Within those timelines, you need to have a finish date, but within the period of start to finish, you need to have key dates in there where you can start reviewing. You can milestones in place for certain things to be done, and that's really important. And this is the part where a lot of organizations kind of make mistakes, because they don't look at the timelines in terms of what needs to be done first. So certain steps need to be done before the steps can be started. So again, we find with organizations that are doing, say, project timelines for building works, they're estimating 3 months for planning, 2 months for tendering, 12 months for construction period, let's say, right? And they start the project in 2.5 years down the line, or 3 years down the line, they're still having the project completed, because they completely underestimated the work that was involved, but they also put in unrealistic timelines as well, because they didn't think it through. Because they didn't ask the questions. They didn't say, well, how long would it take to plan to get through? Well, yeah, 3 months, but if you've got objections, it's going to take longer. What's the chance of objections happening? So they put in no risks in there in terms of if there's objection to planning, how long does that push your project out for? Okay, because they didn't think it through. And this goes back to an awful lot of groups where they have the templates, they have the tables, or they have the spreadsheets or the Gantt charts or whatever they're using, and they start putting in numbers just to tick the boxes and fill in the form. Right? You need to think logically about your projects you're doing. So like Sean, your project, what has to happen first? What has to happen second? What has to happen third? You mentioned there about, like, it was insurance. Does that have to be in place before work starts? Yes, it does. So you organize volunteers and they want to know when's the start date. We don't know yet because we have to wait for the insurance to come through. They go, okay, well, come back to us when you kind of know what you're doing, sort of thing. So you think, okay, what's the steps we need to follow in a logical way before we go on to the next level? And that's why your timelines have to be realistic. If you're applying for funding, in a lot of cases now, they'll ask you for your start date and finish date. Again, people put in dates in those. They put in maybe a Gantt chart or project timeline in there. And again, they're kind of made up because they're just ticking a box. And then the most important part of timelines is that it's linked to your budget. So if you've got a project that's going to expenditure throughout the life cycle of the project, if you get those timelines wrong, it's going to impact on your budget. So again, if you're talking about building a house, you're going to have a timeline for the building works to be done. You're going to have phase payments to the builder. You're going to have phase drawdowns of your mortgage. You're going to have the areas where you're going to need to have some sort of bridging finance there. If you get those timelines incorrect, you're going to start running into problems financially. So because your budget is going to be linked to the timelines you've given. So if you estimate the work is going to be done in 4 months, but it's going to take you 6 months, how do you go back and say, okay, how do we stretch that budget out further? If the deadline to have the work completed is set in stone by leader, and you're getting to a point because of supply issues or getting tradespeople or whatever it might be, and you don't bring leader along with you and you don't inform them early in the process that you're going to run into problems in terms of getting your timeline, and you don't look for extensions on your project, that creates problems. So by having a plan in place where you're thinking long term, thinking, okay, what will happen if this happens, and how can we build that into our plan? That's really, really important. Okay, most people look at this as being something they have to do as like an exercise, because it looks better if they put a plan together or they're reporting back to a stakeholder or to their organization with a plan, and it looks good on paper and they've ticked the box and they presented an action plan to them. An action plan is not just something to do for the sake of it. It's something that's going to be really important for all the projects you develop, because certain things have to happen and they have to be delegated out and tasks have to be completed. If you're not managing that process, it's going to all fall apart, And as you mentioned there, you might be managing 3 or 4 projects at one time and juggling them. If that's not being managed properly and you're recording and reporting and everything is kind of done to some sort of structure, it just falls apart, It just doesn't work. So again, I would be careful with just timelines have to be realistic, budget has to be realistic as well, and this link to your time. Outcomes, what are the outcomes we're expecting? What are the key performance indicators, that we want to have at any stage to know that we're actually on track here? Okay, so what we would say for a capital project would be planning submitted by a certain date, right? So on our planning submitted by the 1st of March, right? We go to the 1st of March, has planning been in? Yes, that we've met that target. It's going to take 3 to 5 months. Again, the indicator is that we'd have planning approved within a 5-month period, and there'd be all these things happening within a time frame that we would put in as we can measure our performance and as what we're achieving as we're going along. And again, keep them realistic. Some people put in completely unrealistic performance indicators in there, and they're not going to achieve it. And then what happens is that people get kind of disheartened that they're not doing anything or nothing's happening. So what we normally do is we can fairly realistic in terms of, we work with the agencies, work with stakeholders, and look at in terms of what they want to see. Have they anything built into their reporting structures that we need to build into our timeline here? So if we're working with an organization like yourselves, for example, on a feasibility study, and we might be working on, there might be, say, 3 or 4 stakeholders around the committee that we're reporting to for a piece of work. And let's say the piece of work is 4 months. We normally, in our tender, we're asked to come up with a Gantt chart in terms of a time frame, what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, what tasks are going to be completed and by when. We would normally build into that time frame, at least, depending on the project, at least 1 monthly meeting or maybe 2 meetings per month with that project team. Okay, so we can then give them updates of where we're progressing. And all that really is that they're confident in that they're being kept in the loop of any issues that can be, need to be addressed, or if we're ahead of schedule or if we're behind schedule, if they need to adjust the timelines or adjust the budget or the drawdowns, that can be done because they're being kept in the loop. But we work with them in terms of what they see as, key indicators for progression on the project. Same thing with your community. If you're engaging with your community, what do they want to see is progress as well? So what do they want to see happening on the ground that indicates progress and something's happening? So if you're communicating with your community and you're engaging with them and you're consulting with them, and you're saying to them, this is what we're going to do, they're going to expect it to be done. But how do we show them the work is being done? some groups will do it, and they'll have a newsletter, they'll email, they'll put up the website, the progress, they'll use photographs, they'll say, look, we started this work, we're now at this stage, we've got this much funding in, this is our next phase, and they bring the community with them the whole way. Again, the project word this morning, they fundraised for the start of this project 2 years ago, nothing's happened since. They're finding it hard to fundraise now because the community is saying, we don't see anything happening, we don't see any progress at all. So is it going to happen? What they should have done was, knock the wall, to grow out a bit of the site, start some basic construction works there, put in some landscaping, did some planting, did something. Because then the community say, okay, when they started something, they've started this process. Whereas now, they're just looking at a greenfield site with a building on it, nothing happening, but yet they've been fundraising for the last 2 years. Okay? People need to be brought along. No one's told them this is the problems, we reached this problem. That wasn't communicated to them. So they haven't been brought along with it. So make sure if you're looking at our timeline and our action plan, where do we start building in some sort of indicators along this process so we can see if we're on track here or not. Okay, really important, because if you don't, it's just going to go all over the place. It's not going to be completed within time. It's not going to be completed within budget. It's very important to identify all the risks that could come up. And again, this is what I said earlier in terms of talk to other groups, talk to other projects, go to a group that anywhere in the country and say, look, you did this before. What should we be aware of? What are the pitfalls here? What are the obstacles? What could happen that could stop this in its tracks, or what could happen down the line potentially? And you build those into your plan. So how are you actually trying to avoid those risks? So what's the likelihood of it happening? Is it very likely to happen, or is it less likely to happen? Again, Sean, your project there, for example, if you can't get insurance, there's no insurance company to take it on, is there a risk of that happening? What do you do then? So you ask others, or you ask the stakeholders, what are potentially the risks here in relation to this project? If you take, say, leader funding, we'd always build into it, there's going to be a delay in the drawdown of the grant aid, because there always is. So we go back to our project budget, our cash flow, to say maybe for an entire project, that says 12-month project or 12-month timeline. And we look at the budget and look at drawdowns, and we say, okay, we anticipate that we'll have the report into leader on the 1st of March. In theory, they should have that money back to us by the end of March. But knowing from talking to other projects, it could take 3 months for that money to be drawn down. That brings us with our situation into where we're not going to see any money coming back into the bank account on our cash flow until April, May, June. How does that impact? What do we do then? Do we need to go to the bank and get provision of a loan or loan in principle to cover us in that case that we are going to be seeing a shortfall waiting for the grant to come back? Okay, that's where you built in risks into your action plan. Rather than getting to the 1st of March, dropping in the information into leader, onto leader by the end of March, where's our money? We don't see any money in our account. There's been a problem with this signature, that piece of paperwork. And now you're like going, we get from the standstill because we have no money in the account to cover this. Then you go to the bank and you look for, apply for a loan. They might turn you down. They might say, we'll give you an answer in 10 days' time. You're now into problems. So you anticipate where the problem is going to be, and then you build in things into your plan that if it does happen, you're hoping it doesn't happen, but you got a plan B to fall back on. Okay. And the only way you're going to know those, if you've been involved in a project before and something similar to the project you're developing now, you know these things because you've been through the process before. If you haven't been, always talk to other groups and say to them, okay, what were the issues? So you can build it into your project. Okay. So really important when you look at the project plan. Major part of the project management process, because everything links back to this. Everything is going to be geared on what you say you're going to go and do. Okay. The next stage is you execute or implement the plan. And this is where you've now gone to the point of no return as such. You're now in the middle of it. And this is where you're I suppose, who's going to be your project manager, who's going to be leading out the project, this is where they come into play in terms of they're the ones going to be managing the process and reviewing it and controlling it. Okay. This is where it works better if you've got a team, because you've got more than one person responsible and accountable for different elements. If it's a small project, it's manageable. If it's a larger scale project, there's lots of moving parts within it. You need to have a team there that's kind of working with yourselves implementing this. So the implementation of the project in terms of what are the tasks involved. So go back to your action plan. who's going to do the tasks, when are they going to do it? Even within those tasks, can we break those down further into individual kind of projects? So if there's large pieces of work to be done within the project, can we break those down to smaller pieces of work? So, for example, you might be looking again, large-scale capital funding project. We need to go through a tender process. That's a project within the project. What are the tasks to get that over the line? Who's responsible for it? What sort of control and review process have you got in place? So, who's managing this in terms of who's controlling it, who's reviewing it, who's keeping an eye on what's happening on an ongoing basis, especially if you're outsourcing work. So if you've got contractors involved, you've got other teams involved, or multiple teams of people involved in this, they're doing different elements of the work, who's reviewing and controlling all that. Again, in terms of is there inspections required? There's people to sign off, and there's engineers involved. Who's managing that side of it? A lot of organizations that are doing, again, building works or capital works or infrastructure works will give complete control over to the project manager from the building side of it. So your architect or engineer, whoever's your person assigned to manage and supervise the project, they give them control over everything. And that's not a good thing, because they're only controlling one element of it. They're not controlling the funding side. They're not controlling the stakeholder engagement. They're not controlling the community engagement. Okay, they're only controlling their specific part of it. What we would tend to do there is that they would be part of the project team, or the project management team, and their responsibilities are very clearly focused on sign-off and the engineering and the structural side of things. But they're part of the project management team who look at other elements of it. And it's constant review there. So again, how do you if when you're progressing with your project, is there built into your plan flexibility that you can modify and change that at any time? Can you change the scope of the project? Can you review it? Can you modify it? Okay, and with community projects that are publicly funded, you kind of nearly have to, but as we said earlier on, and Trish said earlier on, you're sometimes tied so tightly to the criteria and to guidelines that there's very little flexibility around that. Okay, but in an awful lot of cases, there has to be flexibility, because just the nature of the way the sector works in terms of funding, in terms of support, in terms of delays, you got to be able to modify and change them. If you're looking at publicly funded projects, there's always going to be delays in terms of funding. So if you apply for a grant, you've no idea when that grant is going to be assessed, when it's going to be, approved, when it's going to be allocated, when contracts are going to be signed, when you're actually going to get money to you, when you get to go ahead to actually do the work. We're working with we've worked with 8 sports clubs last year that applied for sports funding. They still haven't got word if their funding's been approved or not. Nearly 12 months later. So there's tenders that were got back then, they're completely null and void now. You've got people out there looking at probably 30%, 40% higher costs than they would have had when they asked for pricing last year. That's a project you can't manage. You can't manage that, because it's completely, so loose that they don't know where to go with it now. So they might have had a project plan or a study done or a strategic plan or development plan done 12 months ago, but they know that's going to completely change now, because they have no idea when funding is going to be available. So you have to be able to modify, adjust your plans and your action plans. Okay. Risk management, we looked at it until we discussed it. Again, how do you manage the risks on an ongoing basis? And again, if you're not managing your project, on top of it in terms of what you're supposed to be doing, you're going to, miss problems. You're not going to identify risks or issues early enough, and they're going to create problems for you. So it's about how you manage those risks and how you identify them quickly and how you deal with them. And then the second last one there is reporting and communicating. Again, if you've got a situation, private company scenario, you're reporting probably to your senior manager or senior management team. That's pretty much it, right? With you yourselves, you're reporting to your stakeholders, you're reporting to the community, you're reporting to, your boards. How is that done? In what format? How regularly? How much information do you give them? How much information do you withhold from them? What do they need to know? What they don't need to know? These are all things that need to be built into your plan as well. But in terms of when you're implementing the project, who you're communicating with. So again, in terms of the stakeholder element of it. This goes back to the point I made earlier on in terms of when you might have the local authorities involved and funders involved. If they're not being communicated regularly, there's going to be issues there in terms of problems will arise. Okay, and that's going back to the point I made about having them part of your project management team. They're around the table. They're part of the discussion on an ongoing basis. Okay, so you're not communicating out to them. They're part of the discussion from the very beginning and throughout the whole process. Okay, and then lastly, in terms of project management tools and software. So again, it's something that I'll discuss with you in a few minutes in terms of what do you want to look at in terms of what sort of tools and software or systems you can use to help you manage your projects. So are you going to use software packages? Are you going to use just Excel spreadsheets? Are you going to use like smart sheets? What way would you want to, what do you use currently, and what would you use or would like to use, and then learn more about or look at the various different options. You pretty much have to use some sort of a system to manage your budgets, your timelines, your issues, your notes from meetings, so you can actually manage them and keep an eye on them and control them and communicate on them. A lot of groups don't. It's very, very haphazard. Nothing's written down, nothing's kind of planned out. Just very kind of limited budgeting. No one knows what's being done. No one knows who's doing what. No one knows when it's supposed to be done, and it's just kind of like they just plod along meeting to meeting. There's some very simple tools that we use, and it's literally just Excel spreadsheets we use. We don't use any kind of software. For two reasons. One, because if we're sharing information with the client, if they don't have that software, if they don't use the software, it's a waste of time. They just can't use it. They can't engage with it. If they've got a specific software they use to manage their projects, some have, some don't. But if it's just an Excel spreadsheet, it's very, very simple. It's very something simple we can share with them. They can understand. They're used to spreadsheets. They see spreadsheets. It's very, very simple. There's no sign-ins, there's nothing like that. So we just keep it very easy for them to manage it. But I can discuss, I'll be going through a few with you next week in terms of, not next week, but the week after, in terms of some of the tools you can use, some of the software you can use. Some are free, some are paid. But again, just keep it very, very simple. Just look at the more people involved and what they will be able to use and what they can understand as well. Okay, so I just want to stop the share for a second. So
just going to say there, Tom, just as volunteers, say we run 5 or 6 projects like that a year. So say you have 20-30 grand project. 20% of the cost of that project is doing that project management that we've just discussed. If you take pure volunteer work and add it all up, you're looking at a full-time employee to take on that role, and we're doing this as volunteers at the moment. And just a general discussion, like, it's not sustainable. I know we can't keep that rate up. We can't ask people to give them hours up continuously, project per project. It's your success is nearly your downfall now. So it is. You're outgrowing what you can do as volunteers, and just maybe for other groups, you're going to hit that brick wall or that wall at some stage, and you need to maybe devise employees or expand out or something at some stage. It's just and we can't get that project management cost back. We can't claim that in any means or forms. Even expenses, petrol or diesel for people going out and doing all this meetings and all that. So it's you can see the complexity of it, but you can see the personal cost as well that's involved.
Absolutely, yeah, completely. Like what we're just talking about there for the last 3, 4 or an hour and a half, whatever. Like that sort of that level of work is what a project manager does on a project, but they're being paid for it, and that level of work is even more so for publicly funded projects, because you got so much accountability, so much transparency, so much reporting back and forth. There's actually more work involved in managing the projects you're involved with than there would be, say, the projects that a private company would be involved with. That would have a team of people working on a specific project that are dedicated to that project and project only and be paid to do it. Is there an answer to it? there's not really. We've been asked to, it's kind of topic at the moment, we've been asked to give a talk, which we actually can't give a talk, it's on the same night as this workshop. We've been asked to do it anyway, but about how organizations can sustain themselves long term on a voluntary basis, right? And I kind of said, to ask me to talk, and I'm like going, if I had that answer, sure, I'd be working an absolute fortune, you know. And the key thing that came back to me was said, well, you know, what can you do to get new volunteers on board, right? And that's kind of the solution that people see to this, is that, as you said there, Alan, the same people involved in project after project after project after project, right? And there's burnout there because people just have lives and they have their own things going on, and they can't keep going back to the well every time and just saying, okay, let's drive on with another project again. Just people get fed up with it. The solution to that at a wider level is bringing in new volunteers that would get involved, and they would take over the new projects. So we will see what's happening, say, but take a GA Club as a perfect example of it. You know, the same group of people have developed the pitch day one. They bought the pitch back in 1975, right? They were responsible for getting the pitch seeded and lined. They put the dressing rooms in, they put in the floodlights. And the same people involved over the years that have been fundraising and doing the whole work. And it's burnout there. The answer at a higher level within the local development sector and local authorities and public sector and government sector is, you know, you engage and get new volunteers on board so they can then take over new projects. And in theory, that makes perfect sense, and that's the solution. But in reality, that doesn't happen. Because what happens is that the people that are out there that are being asked to volunteer, they see the level of work that's been involved by ye in doing these projects. And they're thinking to themselves, if I say yes to this, you know, all I'm doing is jumping into the fire they're trying to jump out of, you know, and they won't. They know, and I wouldn't. I'm not going to get involved in that. That's I'll be stuck in this forevermore. And I'll, you know, so you come up with an excuse. The other solution to this is also probably impossible, and that's going back to the paid to find some people you can pay, find funding to pay someone to do it. And that's really the discussion needs to happen at a national level, that this coordination management role within the not-for-profit sector needs to be addressed big time. You know, there's an amount of employment schemes across the board, you know, it always has been. And they need to look at how we can start creating employment schemes where we can actually give communities funding to pay people to manage projects better within their communities. And that could be one person, like, you know, you got your community council type structures that are kind of umbrella structures. That could be one person that's kind of working with every community group within a community and helping them and assisting them or advising them. And this is where it goes back to the third solution to this would be where the local development sector take on a role like this. Okay, so when I started working in the local development sector first, as an enterprise officer, I then moved into what was called a community enterprise officer. And I was being paid by my local development company to work with communities on the ground on developing projects and helping them get the projects off the ground, get them structured, get them funded. Okay. There is development officers now within local development companies, but their role is more admin roles now and managing paperwork and doing all that, more so than going out and actually doing the work for communities. So they'd say to the community, you do the work, you do all the planning, you do all that. We might pay you for a mentor to go work with you know, whatever else, but you do all that. And we just do the administration of it in-house now because our roles have kind of changed slightly. They need to review that again. They need to have, you know, teams of people in communities working with community volunteer organizations. That's not the ideal solution because it's not sustainable either long term. But the answer to the question, I can't, you know, my ideal scenario here is where they create a fund where communities can apply for a grant, which would be, you know, which is an employment grant or subsidized grant or subsidized employment scheme where they can hire someone to manage. No, it won't be just manage one project, that's managing a number of projects to make a value for money. But that's the only way, because it's not sustainable the way we're doing it, you know, because you are asking people to constantly come up with new projects and then to develop them and then manage and implement them and then do all the drawdown and everything else with it. So it is difficult, absolutely. And you let's go back to the project management team thing. You know, the project team is fine, but unless you can kind of replace that team with new people every time there's a new project, that becomes unsustainable as well, because now you can say one person being burnt out, you have 5 people being burnt out because the same people involved. So it's a difficult one. I don't know what the answer is to be honest, Alan. I just think that, but it's going to come to a point where, I'm seeing it firsthand across the sector, where there's a lot of problems out there because it's getting more and more bureaucratic. It's getting more and more difficult to get these things off the ground. It's getting more and more difficult to manage them. You need a higher level of skills, and expertise, and knowledge to do it. You need to be there has to be. It's like businesses now being, it's even more difficult than run an organization than a private company, and it's going to crack. It's going to crack. People just won't continue where they're going, and then on the other side, you see the amount of waste in terms of, within the public sector, in terms of, if we just got a fraction of that money that's being squandered, look at all the good work we could do in this sector over here, and that's the other issue. And that's creating a lot of frustrations too with people in terms of, they see the money's being pumped into, consultants, getting paid a fortune to do the work that brings projects to the very beginning. Then they're gone, being paid a lot of money to do it. But then the real money is needed to actually implement projects. We can't get money for that. And that's another problem. And this called talking from a consultant. We question what we're doing sometimes, thinking, why give us 5,000 euros to the Untitled Town group to do a Untitled Town plan when they need 5,000 euros to plant trees and plant shrubs and paint walls and put up hanging baskets? That's what we need the money for, not for someone to tell them to do it. And that's, that was just off the conversation here slightly, but that's the issue with it. Because I just think that from a management point of view, what we're just talking about tonight, that is an awful lot of work for a voluntary team to take on board, and a lot of responsibility, especially if you're dealing with funding, and sometimes large scale funding is public money as well, and it's got to be accounted for. That's a lot of responsibility in any team, I suppose all I'm trying to do is show ye how you can manage in such a way that, I'm not saying it's going to be easier, but it's going to be more manageable, and it's more, a kind of very efficient and effective way of doing it, so that it'll save you a bit more time, it'll get you more kind of streamlined in terms of managing that, and save you problems on the line. Really, it's kind of what I'm kind of focusing on the next 2 nights. But yeah, I totally agree. A lot of this should be people paid the same way. If you took on a project, like say a large scale project like the road RDF funding or URDF funding, they allow up to 10% project management fees as part of the application. So that if you're talking about, say, a €3 million project, that's 300,000 euros they allow for managing that project. Not the architects, engineers, supervising, whatever. But there's companies out there paying 70, 80 grand a year for a project manager to manage that project, and they have no problem getting that. So the question would be, why aren't they doing something similar across the board then? If you can pay consultants to do, mentor rates and consultancy rates per day, why can't you could include, that for a community group to either do themselves and get paid to it, or to hire someone else in to do it? The money's there, it's just how it's structured.
Yeah. Plus, we have to do our operations.
Exactly.
The background as well.
Yeah.
So we are volunteering our time for our operations, but especially in projects, is a killer. And all of our project work, it's not as though we're building, say, a GAA hall that we're going to get the benefit. We're doing work for the environment and the community, and we don't benefit from it really.
Yep.
Firsthand. Okay, yes, we all benefit from it, but
that's just, again, that's something that's actually, I suppose, is relevant to yourselves. Do you find that because there's no tangible impact, or there's no real, is it a case of, like, say, well, this goes back to, I suppose, wider discussion about the environment in terms of people don't see the direct impact of it. So it's like, say, there, if it's a GA hall, we can see it's built, it's there, and people benefiting. Whereas people, don't see the direct impact of, let's say, a project you're working on. They might be aware of it, it doesn't really impact them directly. So therefore, they don't see the value or why we should get behind and support it. Is that something that's come up with the projects you're working with or working on? Like, do you find that people say, well, yeah, sure, I can't receive, how's that going to help me, or how's that going to benefit me, so I'm not going to get involved?
Well, you have to do a sort of a promotion campaign after the work. You have to put it in the media and social media and get lots of photographs and post it wherever you can and go on forums and different meetings with other, interested parties and showcase everything you've done. And there's a lot of work on that as well. So there is, just to get that across, because some of the work we do, it could be in one individual farm, and only that one individual farmer will ever see it or benefit from it. But okay, yes, downstream the rest of the community benefits from it. But unless you've got somebody downstream, say like a group water scheme that's extracting the water, then they'll latch on to that and say, yeah, that's great work, and we're glad and we're happy to see it as well. But a lot of cases, nobody else really sees it. And if we go out into the street shaking a bucket for this kind of work, nobody puts money into the bucket, whereas a GEA club can go out and shake a bucket and people will throw money into it, so.
Yeah. And I think that's the, I suppose then the question there would be then in terms of, because it's harder to fundraise, harder to maybe get engagement from people on that because they don't see the direct impact of it. But yet it's going, it has always been, but it's even more so going forward. It's crucial, the work you do. That's where I think the argument needs to be back to the department saying, okay, look, you got your climate action goals, you got all your sustainability goals, you got your environmental goals, you got all this being built into funding on the line. We're finding it hard for Joe Public here to grasp this because they don't see, most people having a clue about climate action or emissions or pollution unless it actually impacts them directly. They don't really care unless it's really impacting them. They don't really care until the water's turned off because the water quality is bad and there's a boil notice. That's when they care about it. But before then, they don't care at all. So it's about how do ye get government to say, okay, well, we're helping you achieve your objectives here that you're stating clearly. How are they going to fund it? If it's not coming in the same level of funds coming from the private sector in terms of sponsorship or partners or the local fundraising, they need to be funded some way. And that might be an argument that you can use maybe over, you might have that argument, I suppose, an advantage over other groups where you can say, well, we're struggling here because there's no real direct impact. We can't go out there and shake a bucket and get loads of support for it. But yet we need to do it because it's policy to do it. Can they support it another way?
I think, Tom, there's one thing, the third cycle of the River Basin Management Plan is out for consultation at the moment. And, one of the big objectives of the second cycle was that there would be community engagement. And, LAWPRO, Donald's here, I'm not sure if you might be at another meeting, but it was the engagement. And, that was the big thing to get people involved. But engaging people, as Alan said, it's how do you measure it and how do you measure water quality improvement? Ross McDonald from the Dromore River Group, he was on chatting to us last week. We just had a committee meeting, and they're saying really the Irish Water should have a role in supporting catchment organisations. If we're doing work to do source protection of water supply, that is Irish Water's job, is to supply clean water. And then of course you have the whole tinderbox of the Irish public's attitude to paying water rates, and Irish Water not getting properly funded. But it's just so frustrating. The government wants to, and they want to see better engagement, but what does it? How do you need to pay for people to coordinate, engage people? It doesn't just happen. It's a hard sell, and
that's the point, Liz. Really, in terms of this goes back to a discussion we're having just coincidentally for the last 2 weeks with other organisations that we're working with. And I don't know how, if you can imagine one, it's easy to solve, but you mentioned about engagement and public perception and getting people involved in communication with people. I'd love to see the PR budget and marketing budget for Irish Water, for example, right? In terms of what the cost would that be? And, even if they were to say take a fraction of that and put into what you're doing in terms of engaging people properly on the ground, making them aware, creating that awareness. And you're expected to do that for nothing on a voluntary basis, but yet there's no issue with paying PR firms or marketing departments, or or to deal with problems and deal with issues as they arise and come up with solutions and come up with press releases and stuff like that. I think there's been every day in local radio here there's an issue from Irish Water about a leakage or a water down a boil notice, and it's like this used to be apologise. It's like Kerry County Council apologise for disruption. Now it's like we thank you for your patience and your consideration or something at the end of it. I'd love to get my hands on the budget that's there to paying for those releases every bloody day, and that's the issue. There needs to be a discussion at a lot higher level in terms of the money's there. It's not that it's not there. It's just how it's allocated out. And if you got a percentage of what they're spending on communications, on marketing and PR, and put it into your hands to do something good with it, it still wouldn't be an awful lot of money, but it would be an awful lot of money for ye, and would make an awful lot of difference. And that's the discussion, we did a discussion Monday with there's a group down here in Kerry they provide transport for people getting from Kerry to Cork for cancer treatment. So they bring people on a bus every day from Kerry to Cork to get cancer treatment. They can't get funding from the government, and HC won't fund them. But if the person got a taxi from Tralee to Cork, they can submit their receipts and get a refund from HC to pay for the taxi. And you're going, if you have a budget for that, can you not just give this group a budget for, it doesn't make sense. But that's where the discussion has to happen at every level across the sector at this stage, because if it was a case of there is no money and we can't do it, then fine, we'd accept that and agree with it. But the money's out there. It's just being allocated completely different ways and wrong ways. There's huge money being spent by Irish Water every year. There's huge money being spent by local authorities every year. All you're looking for is, excuse the pun, a drop in the ocean of that, to do what you need to do. And it's not like 500 people working across the country doing what it is. It's just pay people in specific jobs in specific locations to do the work on the ground, but also to have a budget there that you can actually do the work as well and support it. That's really where it's at. I think he's a network, should be looking at lobbying for this, making it very, very clear. This is what we're doing on the ground for very little money. This is not sustainable long term. You've got your climate action plan. You've got all your policy. Every single document is relating to climate, it's relating to environment, it's relating to protection of the environment. What are they going to do about it? Why not now put money into doing this really on the ground? Why not just a policy about it and a piece of paper and a document, back it up with something in terms of funding? And that's, I think he got to shout that fairly loud, because there's like, it crossed the projects in terms of environmental projects. We're working on just transition projects in the Midlands, like the money that's gone into stuff that has no relevance whatsoever to the environment, none. Enterprise centres, enterprise hubs that are being given, hundreds of thousands of euros. You're thinking, what's that got to do with just transition? Think about this. Just look at the allocation of where the money is going to, and start arguing for really is the key. Like, talk about projects. I think that's something that I will be advocating for, is that, just look at what your real costs are, what you're doing and what the real costs are, and what you're covering on a voluntary basis, and put it, and as you said in there, put a value on that. Take that voluntary hours and put a value on it. And if they were paying for that, how much would it cost? So you take, say, average industrial wage is 44 grand a year. And if you had 5 volunteers pretty much working full time, which probably are in it, that's 200, nearly €250,000 that the government is saving every year because of volunteers doing for them.
I think Rivers Trust in the UK put a value on every pound they got. They created £12 worth of work or savings for the government, perhaps, for water companies. It's something that our Irish, I suppose, catchment partnerships or trusts need to look to, develop those stats and hopefully then, challenge Irish Water to give, because, for instance, up in the Wicklow Uplands, I suppose, look, the water resources up there supply raw water for 1.1 million people. And there's not a penny going towards, I suppose, protecting that habitat, even though there's a crisis up there. There's 4,000 hectares of, say, degraded bog and peat, and it's having an impact on Irish Water. There was one fire in the uplands apparently that cost Irish Water 1.4 million in extra treatment costs in a year.
Right.
So these are, like, I think Catherine Farrell is kind of a peatland expert in working in the Encase project, and she just doesn't understand why they can't join the dots. Irish water. I know that there's very little hydrologists or I suppose catchment scientists in Irish water, but you'd like to think that their source protection would link in with the river trust. If
I suppose like the argument they're doing is really that instead of like what Irish water doing is waiting for the problem to happen and then trying to fix it, that you're talking about is prevention. Really, if we can start preventing these issues from at an early stage and recognize what the problems are and do something about, put in measures to prevent it from happening, it's going to save them long term. So
they're like
really, isn't it?
They're like, I suppose it's engineer dominated again, and it's kind of, we can build a bigger plant to resolve the issue. Whereas, like, and they are building, like, it's a brand new water treatment plant in Bartry,
right?
That costs, I don't know, 130 million. Whereas if they're just given some money to protect, or
stop at the source,
exactly. So it's frustrating.
The department, they're looking for 8 new results-based schemes for farmers over the next 5 years across the country, 440 million for it. Roughly, 8 million per scheme, where they're going to fund a project manager, ecologists, admin, advisors. And it's great program to do, but I can't see why we can't get something similar for the Rivers Trust and water projects, because they're there for the environment and a good farming technique, and pay farmers for the results. And part of their work is to improve water quality, but we're just doing it from a different angle and doing equally as good a work and as good of bang for your buck. And why we can't be tapping into some resource like that, I don't know.
It's like don't mention there in terms of UK, like in terms they're measuring the return. Let's say for every pound spent, there's a return there in terms of is it what way they measuring it? Like, is it a return in terms of savings or?
No, it's a result. Sorry, don't want to go on.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, you know more than me. I'd say on Alan. I think it was what's his name? All Rivers guy up in Ballinderry, Mark Horton. Yeah. So you might know the actual more about it, Alan.
Which now, Tom, was it the results-based scheme you're on about?
Or they don't mention there about in terms of UK. They measure, like, say, the impact of every pound spent. They measure the impact of that.
Well, there's a call. First of all, we haven't really collected the statistics for Ireland yet. And so I will try to get involved this year. So it's going to happen around springtime. And I will ask, so this is a good forum because there are a lot of trusts here. So please respond. Let us know your projects and the money's involved, so then we can work on these statistics better. Our team is growing here, so hopefully we have a bit more staff now to actually follow this up and collect this, so that we can get the statistics for Ireland as well, and then we can measure our impact. And as Donald said, I have the number I have in my mind. I don't know exactly now. It's 1 in 4. It's 1 to 4. So for every, I think, euro, it's 4 value, something like that. But hopefully we will be able to do it this year. And this is then a statistics or a slide you can actually show to the funders.
Okay, it's something that it's and it goes back to the argument you present. So, like, when if we're doing, say, if we're looking for public or checker funding for a capital project, we will go back and say, let's say they're investing, say, 4 million euros in a building project. We would look at the numbers of people that will be employed because of that project. And we take their average salary to be on, and we say, okay, over maybe a 10-year period, that's going to generate 10 million per year in terms of salaries for the local economy. So we use kind of like it's 1.5 multiplier. So for every, let's say, euro, is 1.5 times that goes back to the local economy. So we're saying if you're investing 4 million over a course of 10 years, you could be talking about multiples of millions of euros coming back into the economy again. And then you factor in VAT, and you've payroll taxes, so that money's come back into the exchequer straight away. So that's how you justify it. So public spending code, they justify through what's the kind of the cost benefits in terms of what's the return back to the exchequer in terms of spend locally. Same with tourism projects. Say, okay, for every tourist coming in, they spend X amount of money per day. That's going to generate money for the local economy, create jobs, and that's why you invest in it. But that's very kind of, it's very identifiable. 10 jobs are created, 40 tourists going to come in. You can easily kind of quantify that. If you can come up with a way of as you say, Constance, come up with constants in terms of looking at the statistics and looking at the results and looking at measuring those, and you go back and say, look, if you invest in this, you're saving yourselves X amount down the line. And then go back to what you said, Dawn, about Irish Water. You do prevent the problem. So if they're building a better treatment plant, all they're doing is basically getting a bigger band-aid over the problem. They're not solving it at all. It's still going to be a problem, and they're going to have to constantly build to solve it. You're saying, okay, if we do this as a source, look at the savings long term. Because the money, the key point I'm making is they keep saying money's not there. It is there. It's just being spent on the wrong things. It's been allocated the wrong ways. And if you can say we just need a portion of the millions you have, that's all we need to do. But it's about putting that proposal together, putting that argument to them, But I think if you go back to all the various policies and the climate action plans, et cetera, it's they're stating they want to see X, Y, and Z. They've got to do it. And I think you're in a position as a group of trusts to put that argument to them, and
I think in fairness, like Micheál O'Cinada, Joe, he was talking at the webinar today, and he's made the point really well, and as we do as well when we get the opportunity, and the River Basin Management Plan is out for consultation. We do want a coordinated submission going in, multiple submissions saying the same thing, and being effective about it, because Irish Water definitely has roles. Some of the companies that extract water, they all spend a lot of money polishing water for their processes. But it's how people value, and it's changing a mindset that water is not free. That people think it's free, and it's not. It costs money. It costs money to clean it. Here in Limerick, we've got a lot of rivers that is extracted for consumption, not just for going into homes, but going into industry. And it is getting more expensive because the water quality is declining. And that's just the reality. But it's like the tragedy of the commons. If it's everyone's responsibility, it's nobody's responsibility to take action. And that's being long established. So there needs to be government change, and also change in terms of funding that's applied, that you're allowed to go for core funding, because we're providing a societal service that you can't just needs to be sustained.
Is there I don't know which the time, but in terms of, is there a way to look at this in terms of not comparing, but looking at, say, the way other sectors are structured, right? So if you take, say, reps, for example, it'd be, something thinking of in my head, how that's structured, how that's managed, how that's funded. So your advisors going out and they're being paid to go out and provide advice and supports. Is there something that a model similar to that you can look at implementing, where you have the same, that kind of a structure where you got paid staff that are doing that work on the ground in relation to maintenance of rivers and in different areas? So similar to the reps model.
Well, I'm not too sure how reps would work, but the thing is that the supposed to be issue with Rivers Trust is that we build trust. If it was left to the council, the problem with council is that people don't trust council, and also sometimes the council is the authority that will fine people for not doing things. So we're definitely the carrot, we're not the stick, or a charity. So there's advantages and disadvantages to the status of our organizations. I suppose people could say, you could look at the development companies, in terms of the social enterprise and the development that they provide. Is there a way of looking at that? And what we're doing, seeing as a support, because often, being an individual entity is hard, doing all the compliance and all the things that you need. You need backup, you need support staff around you, people with different skill sets. And so it needs to be looked at. But the funders like the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, they absolutely have to take a look at how their funding models and what they allow, because just take for insurance, it is going through the roof. We will not be able to do the activities we need to do because we won't be able to afford the insurance. And that's real, that's happening now. And it's going to become more and more evident as COVID restrictions are lifted and organizations that, haven't, want to expand their activities.
Is this public liability insurance that you can't get, or is this getting so expensive that it's not
being priced out of it or not being able to get quotes?
Okay. So you were saying that one of the solutions there is looking at, say, centralized kind of maybe support where there's one organization getting the insurance and it's basically filtered down. That's something?
No, I wasn't quite saying that, but there does. We like Mark Horton and Joe Trish here. Joe has said, like, we need to say, is there a group insurance scheme, but that's just proving really difficult to get that in place. And I know the UK Rivers Trust have tried that and they haven't been able to come up with a package that would suit everyone's different needs, because everyone's so different in, the level of risk or the level of activity that they're on, or they take on.
Is it coming back to the level of risk that's involved in terms of the work that's being involved that's creating the problems with insurance companies?
Insurance companies, the underwriters, just the Irish market.
Brexit killed it, so it did.
Yeah.
All of our underwriters are either UK or German,
Okay. So but it's not an issue of like just claims and the risks are going up. It's basically there's no one in the market as such.
No, yeah, they've all left, a lot of them. So
okay.
Competition, and also there isn't a book of limits on claims in the Irish system, whereas there is in the UK one.
Okay, this again, and this goes back to the point in terms of this is where another thing needs to be addressed nationally, in terms of this entire insurance situation needs to be addressed in terms of we're involved in a load of tourism projects. Like it's going to get to the point where there's going to be no water-based activity, there's going to be no recreational parks, going to be no walkways, going to be nothing because they can't get insurance. Like I know 3 private adventure projects were shut down and 1 public because they couldn't get insurance. Or they could, but it was just 90,000 euros or something like that. It wasn't, so they're all shut down. The companies your projects and other projects, again, go back to greenways, blueways, all this stuff they're trying to do, outdoor recreation. If insurance companies are going to basically back them, then the government has to step in and provide those insurances, Yeah. Otherwise, what's the point?
Like I was following a contractor we use, he's a forester as well, and a couple of years ago our insurance was say around 1,000 and his was 2,000, and then 2 years later his insurance went to 4,000, and then this year ours is 4,000. Now next year his insurance, this year coming in, he's got a quote of 11,000. So if I'm following his profile, we're screwed.
Yep. The whole thing needs to be just reviewed because it's being ignored, and I don't know why it's being ignored, but it's just it's just madness. Like I think there's companies there with the funding side, the funding model, and the insurance model needs to be addressed, completely, because it's going to shut down. The entire thing is going to shut down at some stage. It's going to get at the point where it's going to be catastrophic, where nothing can happen because everything's going to shut, because of funding or because of the insurance situation. But it is maddening to me. They're just spending millions and millions and millions on infrastructure. Outdoor recreation infrastructure funding is massive, but no one's questioning we can't run. Don't get someone to insure. We can't operate. It's why you give us millions of euros to build these things. That's it's maddening. But anyway, look, again, it's for discussion for another day, I think. But I just think go back to the main points in terms of the funding element of it. I think there's probably some role there as a network to start lobbying for this, and I've been talking to startup groups as well. I've talked to politicians about it too, that the entire thing needs to be addressed at national level, because it's getting to the point where it's going to stop. Like the whole thing's going to standstill. In relation to the project management program, back to what we're talking about tonight. Do you want me to include in the workshops, next to workshops, do you want me to look at specific project management tools that you can use, or like, you know, like some of the software packages, or just go through some of them that we've used or we are using or have used, or is that something that you're not really interested in doing? Because I can pick a few to go through with you. Like, you know, the various different project management software that you can use for managing projects, or, you know, again, I used to use Excel, so I have used other ones as well. Do you want me to look to focus on those two or look at them?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Perfect. On the email, when I send out the template, sorry, the slides to you and the various similar resources as well, will you come back to me if you have any specific areas you want to focus on? In the 4 steps we focus on tonight, we'll be covering those more detail over the next 2 nights. But is there anything that you want me to focus on specifically that is relevant to your projects? We can come back on that. Yep.
Yeah, contingency planning.
Contingency planning. Okay, brilliant.
Yeah, it catches us out, especially if we're doing river works and something goes wrong. It can get us into big trouble.
Okay. Anything else? Or
Well, I was going to say, how do we build a team and delegate? But, I don't know if that's covered.
That is covered. Yeah, yeah. Project team. Yeah.
And risk, Tom, as well.
Okay. Okay. Any other areas you want me to focus on specifically that are relevant to you?
Maintenance, if you can, Tom.
In maintenance, as in?
Well, you know, you finish a project and
so sustaining it after. Okay.
Sustainability afterwards. You know, people want to see more of it, but you have no money to do that. What do you do?
Yeah, it's actually something we cover in terms of, it's actually part of the Senator on, it's part of the initiation and planning stage. So how you built in the sustainability into the actual project itself. So how you identify part of the project work is identifying further sources of funding afterwards to sustain it. So it's a specific piece of work within the overall project, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it kind of happens in parallel to the project being developed. We look at the in game here in terms of what we're going to do. Okay. So if you think of anything else, we come back to my email and just because make sure it's relevant to the project you're working on. Or if you've got a specific project you want me to look at and with you and discuss with you, or to review with you, that's perfect too. So you get as much value out as you possibly can. Okay.
That's great.
Okay. Thanks, Liz, and we'll see you next Thursday, same time.
Lovely. Thanks.
Right.
Tom. I'll put this up.
It's the same link as well.
Yeah, it is the same link, but I've got it set up that I can send the reminder. You should have all got a reminder today with your link.
Yeah.
So I'll just do that again next week, and I'll just put this up on the YouTube, and I can just make it available to the members. But that's great. Okay, thanks, Tom.
Thanks very much. Take care. Bye bye.
Thanks, Liz.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Good night.
Take care. Bye bye.